Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Kyle, Richard, can you nod if you hear me? Okay. Kyle's giving me the thumbs up. I'm Trevor Holmes from the Center for Teaching Excellence. Welcome to Beyond the Final Exam. It sounds like the sequel to a horror movie or something. We hope it isn't that. But we have a few of us from the Center for Teaching Excellence here today to have a conversation about some of the things we can do besides a proctored final exam. There's going to be some advice out there about proctored final exams, but you've probably joined because this is called Beyond the Final Exam. What can we do instead? We have presenting today Kyle Schultz from the Center, our educational development developer for research, and Richard Lee from engineering, the faculty liaison. And Brianna Bennett is hosting us today on Teams, and she's working in the center as special projects assistant. So just a few notes to begin with. What we're suggesting is that people keep their mics muted, and we're suggesting video off. I mean, if you want to put your video on, that's fine. We are recording the session, and we think in general, for privacy reasons, a lot of people don't necessarily want their videos on. And that's good reasons. So if you want to, you can. It's not prohibited, but it's helpful for bandwidth if you don't. You also, if you are finding that things are lagging or you're having some difficulty with your internet speeds, with the ellipses at the bottom hovering menu in your Microsoft Teams menu, you can turn off incoming video. The other thing you can do from that same menu is turn on auto captioning, live captioning if you need to. So what we're going to do today, how we'll proceed, is that we'll use the chat feature for you to ask questions. And, we'll have a couple of questions for you as well. And you can answer them in the chat. So in order to reach the chat, you can find it. It's kind of like the third button from the right on your hovering menu across the bottom. So without further ado, I guess we'll begin. And again, the session will be recorded for future use. So one of the things that happens in a lot of workshops is people kind of intone a land acknowledgement and then move on, kind of like okay, we've done that, now let's move on. I would rather try to tie this kind of acknowledgement to the work we're trying to do together when we come to a workshop or a webinar. So you'll realize and know that we do live and work, and we created this workshop and webinar on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, and that the University of Waterloo is on the Haldimand Tract, Block 2, which is 6 miles on each side of the Grand River that was promised to the Six Nations. The graphic that you see shows the amount of land that remains in Haudenosaunee control. So I know that some of you may not be here on the Haldimand Tract, and if you're interested in knowing more about the land you're on, you can visit nativeland.ca. The connection I want to make, though, to today's webinar is that I think that one of the things about the proctored timed final exam is it's one of those tools that has become habitual in a particularly kind of westernized, colonial, industrial sense of education. And I think that it's on us to kind of contest that. And part of today's work will be to rethink the timing and the ways of being and ways of phenomenologically experiencing an exam that are bound up in those particular norms. So from a kind of cultural capital perspective or an intercultural perspective, I think that we can do better than the proctored 2-hour or 3-hour final exam. So in thinking about final exams and what we do and why we do it, I wanted to bring us back to a few first principles and a few fundamental questions. So why do we examine, right? And you may have some thoughts that you want to put in the chat, but my thoughts include things like, we need to know that learners know stuff, or that they can do something with the content we're teaching them, or the concepts or the skills, right? The other thing we need to verify is that it's the learners themselves who are doing the learning, and it's their own learning. It's not mom or dad or sister or brother doing the learning for them, or friend or some purchased service doing the learning for them, and that they're doing their own learning. So sometimes exams are the only way to show that. Okay. I have some questions about exams themselves, and I notice that my network is lagging a bit. I don't know if I'm lagging for you folks or not. I see Kyle shaking his head, so it seems okay. So existing exams, are they testing the things I'm actually teaching at the level I'm expecting learners to perform? That is to say, do I want people to be at kind of like the apply level or synthesize level of like Bloom's taxonomy, but then I test them at a kind of recall level, so there's a mismatch between levels? And then how much of my summative assessment practices might have to do with like logistical convenience or staffing issues? Like I have one TA this coming term, or I have two TAs, or I have no TAs, versus showing evidence of actual learning. That is to say, am I mostly looking at what I can do rather than what's possible based on logistics? That's totally reasonable, because academic labor being what it is, we only have so much time in the day. But let's think about ways we could rethink the exam marking even without, for example, TAs. So the other question I have is it true that my discipline requires people to bring all their thoughts together and prove all the new knowledge from the last 12 weeks in 2 or 3 hours under the watchful gaze of an authority figure? Are there other examples of this in their future careers or in the life of the discipline where that is good practice? Maybe it is. Is it true in every course, or is it merely habit in our disciplines? The other question I ask is, are the current tests that I use and the exams I use, proctored final exams, actually reliable and valid? Have we done a sufficient amount of testing on the validity and reliability of our multiple choice tests, for example? Lots of people have not. So we're not even sure that they work to do what our original goal was, which was to verify that learners know stuff, and we can see that the learners know stuff, and the learners can see that they know stuff. So you may have some other questions. And I see already in the chat a really good point that students use studying for the exam to actually do the learning of the material, and that's a great point. And I won't jump ahead of myself, but I will say that in a previous life, when I was helping students prepare for exams, we would do a large class concept map of the course, and it was during that activity that a lot of people solidified their knowledge. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for the synthesizing you do when you prepare for exams. And there are good reasons for exams, but we're trying to think of other ways to achieve some of the same stuff. So, yeah, are we only testing the test-wise students, right? Or like how valid and reliable are we being with our tests? So I wanted to remind people of the CTE kind of like model of course design. When we ask people, what do you remember about CTE workshops? People say things like alignment. Okay, so what's alignment? That's where we take the concepts, like the content that you're teaching, the knowledge, skills, and values, and make sure that everything's aligned between the intended learning outcomes, the teaching and learning activities you do between classes or from week to week in an asynchronous environment, and the formative and summative assessments. So, yeah, I'm just going to quickly go over that to set the stage for some examples that Kyle's going to present about, and that then we'll return to a course that I changed from a final exam to something else. So keep in mind that the learning outcomes will often have a context in which people have to perform a certain task, right? So we have a kind of a behaviorist paradigm about learning outcomes, and we often use verbs. And these verbs help us to decide what we're going to test on too. And so our exams should also be kind of aligned to these kinds of verbs. But one thing that learning outcomes can do is to differentiate the goals of the course from the means of achieving them. Is the means of achieving these goals always going to be a timed test, right? Not necessarily. We get to learning activities, which is another pillar of course design. Now that we're thinking remotely, we've got to be designing for possibly synchronous and definitely asynchronous contact. And by contact, what I mean is students need to have contact with the course material. They should also have contact with the prof in some way, or the TA, and they should also have contact with each other. So those are the kinds of contact that you're designing for. Consider also the responsibilities of the learners and the instructors. Who's doing the learning and how, right? So teaching might involve informing. Learning certainly involves practice. So we want to have activities that help students to practice, kind of rehearse for the successful achievement of learning outcomes, so that they have a chance to see that they can do this, master this stuff before a cumulative or summative assessment. And speaking of formative and summative assessment, you've heard us probably before talk about the difference. And so formative assessment is often that process of iterative feedback, involves some dialogue, not always even graded. And we'll get a bit around non-graded work in a short while. Some assessment does occur during the term, but also sometimes occurs just at the end, and typically involves not a heck of a lot of dialogue, except the grade itself, maybe some feedback that they can use in a future course. It's often graded. The framework for assessment that we typically use is that assessment is a form of interpretation. You are getting evidence from the students, so you're setting the context for them to give you evidence from which you will reason the kind of learning that they did. So I'm not sure if you've thought of assessment that way before. You're observing to obtain evidence, you're interpreting based on that evidence. Therefore, does it always have to be in a final exam? I don't think so. So on that note, I'm hoping that Kyle will wrest back presentation mode from us. And in the chat, I'm hoping that Kyle will post a poll for you to answer about your own assessment practice. And the poll has to do with whether you typically use a final exam and what percentage of the whole course is it? What grade weighting do you assign? For example, 20%, 30%, 40%, over 50%. And I know some of you might have some nuances like, yeah, it's 35%, but if somebody does better on it than the midterm, it's actually 55%, something like that. There's no room in the poll for that kind of nuance. But we'll get to that poll in a second, I think. And Kyle is waiting. Waiting, and it's uploading. New messages, there they are. Okay, so in the chat window, you will see a poll. I typically have a proctored final exam where it's less than 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40%, 40 to 50, more than 50, or I don't have a proctored final exam. If you could start voting on that and submit your vote, we'll see the results start to pile in, and we'll be able to think about our own comments back to you as the webinar proceeds. And we also have a question for you around what kinds of challenges you foresee in departing from this kind of 40 to 50% exam, which 75% of the respondents so far are running. So I'll just type that out as a question too. Okay, Kyle, do you want to take back control and start your physics slides?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. And it is just neat seeing the questions come in or the responses come in, because we want to kind of start to tackle this idea of a final exam from the perspective of something that seems like it'd probably be pretty common based upon your responses, like this idea of having like a big final exam, right? Like a final exam that's worth quite a bit, and that's what you utilize to determine whether or not your students know what they should know in your course. That's pretty commonplace. So we wanted to spend the next little bit of time going through a couple of examples of both more STEM discipline examples and also some more social science humanities examples as well. We're not trying to necessarily say that, well, these examples are only for STEM or only for social sciences or humanities, but rather maybe some different ways to think through alternatives to a final exam that might align better with your discipline. So again, as we're starting to talk through these, please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat or responses to Trevor's question specifically. After we tackle some of the STEM examples, we'll take a brief break to tackle any questions as that might have come up. So again, this is a Physics 101 exam. This is an exam. It comes from Princeton, but you know it's a big exam. I think it's 151 questions or 151 points at least. I think it's a big exam that students would typically do at the end of a term, and you know it's got questions that they would write down and just fill it out, and it will take you a lot of time. So that's one way to do things, yes. And at the same time, too, when we think through, you know, so like what purpose does that exam have? Trevor just spoke about that alignment framework where you have your learning outcomes and your interpretations and your observations as well. And, you know, part of that is, well, yeah, so what are the learning outcomes that we need to think about for our course, and what assessments do we need to have for those learning outcomes? So these are some sample learning outcomes for a similar physics course. This is from actually Joe Sanderson, one of our physics instructors here at UW, for a Physics 111 course, so a really introductory physics course. These are the kind of outcomes. We're not saying these are how his outcomes are being met in his course, but these are the kind of outcomes you might expect in a early physics course that might then utilize a final exam similar to that big 151 point exam. So you might have, for example, some of these activities that Trevor spoke about, things like watching screencasts, maybe answering some problem sets, maybe doing a practice examination, and then maybe doing some feedback, or the feedback itself on the practice examination as another form of a learning activity. And then again, maybe some standard summative style assessments would be this big file enrichment examination, as we spoke about, maybe some weekly short quizzes as well, things like that. Again, we think these are pretty standard ways you might envision a physics course, an introductory physics course. And that's absolutely fine. So the question then is, well, like what else can we do aside from just a big final exam, basically? And when we think through that as well, like, we really want to think through how are we structuring these scaffolded culminating assignments? Because one of the things with having teaching and learning activities embedded into our courses, especially remote courses, is that there is a scaffolded nature. We want to see what students are learning, give them feedback on what they're doing, so that when it comes time to come to this bigger assessment, they've had chances to practice, receive feedback, and prime themselves to be successful. So we're thinking through things like how do we design this equitably? This goes back to principles of universal design for learning, ensuring that regardless of who our learners are or their backgrounds or what they come in to the class with, that they all have the equal opportunity to complete whatever that assignment is, that culminating assessment. We want to ensure that what we're designing, even if it's not a proctored final exam, still retains academic integrity and ensures that students are showing us what they actually know themselves. We're certainly trying to pay attention to the academic labor piece, which I'm sure as we start to talk through some of these examples might come up in your minds. Some of these might sound all well and good, but at the end of the day, if it's just me and I have a class of 200 students, I mean, what can I reasonably do with my own time? How can I be fair with my own time? And one of the things that we like to think about, but we acknowledge is challenging to think about at times, is how to connect our own individual assessments in courses to broader curriculum-based discussions with disciplinary expectations in mind as well. That it's not just my course and my assessment, but it tells part of a story. It's certainly part of a student's trajectory in their program. What I do in my first year course will inevitably connect to what happens in the second, third, and fourth year. So are things connected? So we have to keep some of this stuff in mind as well. But at the same time, too, as we think through some of these alternatives to final exams, the nice part is that it kind of forces us to think through some of these things, and we can't just rely on the big final exam to do that work for us. So again, we're going to try to keep some of these things in our mind as we go through the next little bit. So what we're going to present initially is a list of alternatives to proctored time-limited final exams. We're trying to give you a rather big list to start off with, and we're gonna pick out a couple of these to focus on. I'm not going to go through each of these right now because that would just simply take up too much time. Again, the slides have been shared in the chat at the start of this session, so you can look at these examples in more detail. And of course, we're willing to talk about some of these in more detail during the question and answer section. But these are some examples, again, more STEMmy based ones and humanities, social science based examples that you might think about as alternatives. The one that I will touch upon briefly, because I think a lot of these are self-explanatory, except potentially this notion of an exam wrapper, that first one there. Ever so briefly, because I'm not going to touch upon this one in detail, an exam wrapper is almost a metacognitive technique to utilize with an examination that can either come when students submit the exam and then are immediately met with an exam wrapper, or which they receive after they get their exam back with their feedback. But it's a wrapper because it's meant to encourage a student to take what they're doing in that exam and think through it from the perspective of both, like, how do I think I actually did? But more so than that, like, what did I do to prepare adequately to succeed in that final exam as well? So in some ways, yes, assuming an exam wrapper does then utilize an exam in some capacity, and I mean, the whole point of the workshop or this webinar is to go beyond the final exam. But using things like exam wrappers starts to shift the conversation away from just strictly, yeah, are you doing everything exactly correctly? Do I have to worry about proctoring and on all these components of the final exam, the time final exam? And might put some of the emphasis on, all right, like, as a student, as a learner, what did you do to succeed? What did you do to prepare yourself adequately? What do you recognize that you might have not done as well on? And how do you plan to in the future do better? And how will you study differently? So it does shift that conversation away from simply right and wrong to ways to think through how I as a learner might do better in the future. So that metacognitive approach is quite nice with the exam wrapper that you might consider as well. But again, for today's session, we're going to focus on the following, and these are the ones that are bolded here. So this notion of reports, and I'll go into more detail about what that is, oral examinations, virtual poster presentations, and then Trevor afterwards will start to tackle some of the humanities-based examples with reflective journals and take-home examinations. So just a snapshot of some approaches that you might consider utilizing. So I want to start with this idea of a virtual poster presentation first. And again, we're couching all this within what could be done instead of a 151-point exam like that physics examination that we showed initially. So you might think about the poster presentation as you would for an academic conference where either yourselves as presenters, or maybe you do something similar or have done something similar in a face-to-face course, but having the students, instead of just showing you what they know by answering a bunch of questions, give them a project, give them a task, give them something that requires some research, some investigation into a more of a project approach, and let them present their findings in that poster modality, but without needing to actually produce posters, right? You don't have to go and print these things off and then find a physical location on campus to set up a poster presentation and have students come around to that poster presentation. But instead, there's a ton of useful tools online that exist that could be thought to utilize to create the actual posters. We have things here, for example, like Canva, which is a really robust poster creation tool. That's the screenshot here that you see. That's kind of what Canva looks like as students or yourselves would utilize it, maybe as a way to visualize what a poster could look like and how you present all the information from the students' findings, or things like PebblePad, our e-portfolio tool that we have access to at UW for free. That's an opportunity as well. I mean, keep it simple as well with something like Microsoft PowerPoint and design a PowerPoint slide that functions as a poster as well. But the idea is that just like a poster session, then the student's not just creating this thing in isolation for themselves to showcase to you what they know, but you can instead have an actual poster session and just do it virtually in the remote environment. So we're thinking about things like the discussion board, for example, creating a discussion board where students post their poster presentation, and then other students come by, they view the poster presentation. Maybe there's a little brief description by the student that's written out or even audio recorded, and then other students respond and ask questions and try to learn more about each student's poster presentation. So in many ways, it captures all the thought that goes into designing a really effective poster and synthesizing all that information to showcase one's research. But you just do it electronically and do it virtually and use some of the affordances that we have, either some external tools, internal tools, and learn-related tools as well. So that's one example that we might consider. Another one is this idea of problem set reports. And this is one that we actually just started looking into a little bit more recently, and we're crediting here Jim Martin in physics and astronomy for sharing this with us. And when we heard it, we thought, that's fantastic. It's in some ways it's so simple, but it's also so unique in how we think through having our students show us what they know. So we use this as idea of reports, and the way it works is that students are provided with both a set of problems, but also right away the solutions as well. So yeah, it's like a problem set, but the problem set has the solutions already identified for students. So students then, they're still working through the problems, and they're ideally doing the problems without just immediately looking to the solutions. But even if they do, it doesn't matter, because what we're really trying to determine is whether or not a student knows how to in fact work through a problem to arrive at that solution. It's not necessarily the right answer that matters, but it's all the thinking that goes into coming up with what that right solution is and showcasing one's work. And on top of that as well, then the piece that really kind of ties together for Jim's example, at least, is this idea that they're then summarizing that whole experience of solving the problems in this one-page report. So students are submitting not really like the problems and solutions, they are, but that's not as important as that one-page report that says, all right, like this is what I did, these are the parts I struggled on. It kind of goes back to what I spoke about with that exam wrapper in some capacity, but it's looking at what students or how students are learning. And the nice thing as well is that like students are getting that immediate feedback from answering these questions instead of waiting like a week or two to get feedback from the instructor. They solve the problem and then immediately look to the answer to see if it's right or not. And then the important part again is just doing that report. So for example, this is a snapshot of of a report that one of the students wrote. You can read it here, but you can see the part in the black text is what the student wrote as a report. And the part in the red text then is how Jim responded. And the student, you can see, is questioning what solution he or she arrived at. You know, admitting fully that I might not exactly know what I'm doing here. Or I recognize I'm confused at this point, but can you help me out and understand why I'm confused or what I'm missing? And then for Jim, it allows him to come in and say, okay, well, exactly, here's the feedback I give to you. So something like this is fantastic. I mean, Jim acknowledges when he shared this with us that it does require work, right? It requires him and a couple TAs to go through each student's report and provide more detailed feedback on that report. Um, but I mean, this is what his course is built up of. He uses 6 of these that are worth 50% of the entire grade, and then 6 tests as well for the other 50%, and that makes up the 100% grade. But you have these as that opportunity to practice, try things out, learn what you don't know, and then you still have the tests in place that aren't as high stakes then, um, but allow for a bit more granularity in terms of how students are doing. So again, a really neat idea that we found that can, again, help you think through different ways to assess and still see what students know. A final one then to share at this point in terms of some of the STEM examples is this idea of oral examinations as well. Again, oral examinations, that alternative to the standard written one, that are simply done by a student telling you orally what he or she knows. And you might think, well, that's kind of challenging to do remotely. I mean, it's already challenging enough to do those things face to face, but now the remote environment as well. But it can work too. And you have students answer questions synchronously, and you have yourself or a TA present, and you just, it's useful because you get to dig a little bit, right? They tell you what an answer is, but you don't have to necessarily take it at face value. You can prod a little bit and say, okay, like, why do you think that's the way it is? For issues of academic integrity, if that is something you're concerned about, well, the oral examination encourages them and forces them at times to be completely upfront with what they know or don't know. Um, Again, we accredit Diana here from Statistics and Actuarial Science for thinking through this idea. There's actually a webinar that she did with us a couple of months ago that you can access the YouTube recording for. And the way that she does this is that each student has 15 minutes and they all get 5 questions. And the questions are the ones you can see here. So you fill in the blanks with what you want them to actually answer, but you have a standard set of 5 questions that each student gets. They have 15 minutes to answer the questions, and they can kind of do with them as they wish. She makes an intentionally open book so that students could have resources with them. And if that means they take more time on one question than another, so be it. But you're still getting at the essence of what they know or what they don't know, but doing it in such a way they don't have to worry about that proctored environment where they feel like they're being watched. I mean, it's very intentional here that, okay, yes, they're being watched, so to speak, but it's a conversation. It's not just you observing what they're doing, it's you talking to them about what they know and allowing them to explain more, or again, the limitations of what they know. So it has a lot of neat functionality as well, conceptualized as an oral examination. Again, we can go into conversations about that academic labor piece and the amount of time it might take. But if we're trying to find alternatives for that time limited proctored examination, that is this huge thing, oral examination spread throughout the course in different capacities might be a way to think through it as well. So I'm going to allow us to maybe take a break here for some of the questions. I've seen them pop up as I've been speaking away, and I've tried my best to ignore them and just focus to get done at 2 o'clock, which we're at now. But maybe we can look at a couple. I see, Trevor, you've been responding to some throughout. I don't know if you have a sense, Trevor, of ones to think about now, or I'll see if you have any thoughts before we continue.
Yeah, I really appreciate the focus on academic integrity. Lots of people are wondering how, if you don't have proctored exams, are you sure that the students are the ones making their own posters, right? Or
Right.
how are you sure that the students are the ones doing the actual learning? It's hard to verify that, which was one of our first goals, to verify that students are actually the ones doing the learning. So I appreciate that one. I also appreciate the time it takes to do some of these alternatives. I often contrast that, though, with the time it takes up front to build a really well written, multiple choice exam that grades itself.
Sure.
And the time that it takes to grade short answer questions or whatever. You need a lot, as Barb's mentioning, kind of a rubric for inter-rater reliability if you're using a whole grading team. That's true, though, of really any exams, of any kind of assessment, I think, from essays right through to exams.
Yeah, and I would just put a shout out to Diana as well. If you haven't seen that webinar that she put on, I mean, I didn't do it justice by any means in my 4-minute little synopsis of what she does. Like, she's put a lot of thought into what these oral examinations could look like to be fair, to have reliability. So it's something that I'd heavily encourage you, if you think that's a neat idea, to look at Diana's webinar and look at the recording of that, or even speak to Diana. I know she finds the oral examination as an assessment technique fascinating, has done a lot of research into it, and I'm sure would be happy to talk more about it as well.
Yeah, and I also think that it's a good idea to look at the academic integrity literature and see why students collaborate when they're told not to, or what kind of culture we are raising them into at the University of Waterloo. A lot of teaching developers will say, oh, instead of a big final exam, you should do all these little assignments, little assessments throughout the term, and you should definitely have scaffolded assignments. Now, Kyle and I are sort of agreeing with that, but at the same time, if these students are taking 5 or even 6 courses, some of them, if you stagger everything into tiny little bits, maybe you've gone too far onto the small assignments side of things. So when there's too high a stakes, people will be tempted to cheat. When they're too low as well, people may be tempted to cheat if it's only worth 2 points or something, right? And there's so many things going on each week in all of their courses. So there's probably a more kind of what I call Goldilocks approach, which is just right. It's not too big, it's not too small, it's just right. And figuring that out for your own course and your own discipline is pretty important in these times when people are going to have multiple pressures on them from many directions. So the established literature about multiple small staged scaffolded assignments sometimes assumes that distance learners maybe are taking a couple of courses rather than 5. So just watch for that.
Right. And just seeing Saeed's point here in the chat as well about the oral examination and some of the limitations of these approaches. I mean, by no means are these kind of like fits everyone, right? Like, again, you take even that notion, the Goldilocks approach that you just spoke about, Trevor, like there are some things that it might just not work, right? And that's why we're trying to show alternatives as well, like alternatives, plural. So some of these might work more effectively, or you might envision a world where these might work more so than some of the other alternatives. I
was going to say that I went to a presentation by someone, a professor, I think it was at Guelph, a pair of professors, who had done oral exams with a class size of something ridiculous, like in the 300s or 400s or something.
Wow.
And I was like, oral final exams with that many students. And they found that it was an accurate measure. Like they did some kind of scholarship of teaching research on it, and they were like, yeah, this actually worked. I forget how it worked, but oh my gosh. The other thing I wanted to suggest was Shannon Day and I did a webinar on deepening your course design, which included a little section on authentic assessment. Now, if you're in a discipline where you can grab onto something that is like something professionals do in that discipline, and it has a bit of a public-facing piece at the end,
Yeah.
that also can mitigate the temptation to cheat, because actual stakeholders are going to see it, and it's actual training for their work world someday. Not every discipline has that. I mean, I think I could argue that most disciplines have some authentic assessment you could hang your hat on for your course. So Kyle, do you want me to move on to the humanities example?
I think so. Then we'll have time at the end as well for more questions if they come up. So keep them coming as it comes. Yeah.
So I know that there are social scientists and humanists in the audience today, and I am one. So I'm going to tell you the story of my course moving from a proctored final exam to a more reflective take-home, and the joys and the pitfalls of that. So we know that there's such thing as a good multiple choice exam. We're not against multiple choice exams at the Center for Teaching Excellence. And it is hard to depart from them when you have a good one. A lot of the time, my colleagues in humanities will have students write answers to things, short answers, long answer essays in the moment, right? And they've marshaled their resources. Sometimes they have like a cheat sheet they're allowed, and they go ahead and they write an essay. And the earlier point that was made in the chat, sometimes studying for that kind of exam is where the learning actually happens. And so I wanted to quickly mention that I do have, it's not patented, but it should be, an exam review game where students get that metacognitive brain muscle working by doing joint concept maps with one another. They realize what they know and what they don't know, and that helps them target their studying better. Nowadays, after, I don't know, 26 years of teaching or something, I might say, let's do those concept maps as the assessment instead of just as preparation for an exam, right? So there are ways to help people synthesize at the end of a course other than the proctored final. I'm not talking about that right now, though. What I'm going to talk about is, if I can take back, let me take control of the screen, is an alternative that I used. I don't expect you to be able to read what you see in front of you on the screen. It's very tiny. It's just an example from Women's Studies and the Gender and Social Justice course I'm teaching since 2015 here at Waterloo. It's very similar also to a cultural studies course I taught elsewhere for 10 years. When I taught that course elsewhere for 10 years, for most of those years, it had a proctored final exam. At a certain point, I realized, golly, people are doing these kind of reflective mini journals week to week. Why don't we use those as data for them? They're like just for them. Like I read them, the TAs read them, the students write them, but they never revisit them. So they don't necessarily see the journey of their own learning that I see in their final assessments. So why don't I design a final assessment that helps them show to themselves how they've changed, or if they haven't changed, how they've reconfirmed some original thoughts that they had. So I asked 10 mini journal questions over the 12 weeks. They get like a point for just answering them. So they actually start off in the course, if they answer them, with 10% free marks. The reason I think that's okay is because if they get a 0 on the course, it gets converted to 32 anyway at Waterloo. So why not start off with 10? Okay, so I have this sort of logic built into that. So they do get 10 points off the bat just for doing these from week to week. The first and the fifth journal are always metacognitive about their own learning challenges or their own learning. And that allows them to revisit at midpoint of the course and kind of go, how am I doing with my learning? But the other ones are all prompts that are based on the content of that week. And it doesn't matter whether they've read the reading yet or not. And it doesn't matter if they've read the reading and then do the journal, or not done the reading yet and do the journal. It could be a priming the pump kind of question for their reading in that case. But anyway, we harvest these on the quiz tool in Learn, the long answer quiz, and then we feed it back to them at the end of term and say, this is your data for your final take home. They know what's coming on the final take home. Like I say, it's 3 questions. These are the questions. It's your take home. Don't worry, you don't have to sit in a room and do it. And it's kind of cheat proof in this way because it relies on their own data to make some arguments linked to the text. And you can see, maybe you can read it, I don't know, but the questions have to do with their own kind of learning challenges, their learning narrative from the beginning to end of the course, and a particular thing that changed for them or got reconfirmed for them, and where in the course that happened through readings or lecture activities or whatever. So they reconstruct their own kind of alignment. They like show me their conceptual growth. These things turn out to be a pleasure to read. And they often raise the students' grades. You know, I've toyed around with it being 15% as a take home, or 20%, even 25% some years. But I settle on usually around 15 or 20%. And it relieves a lot of stress in the sense that they're still doing the synthesizing work at the end of the course, but they're kind of motivated to not cheat because they're using their own data. If they don't make a good argument, they can fail this thing, right? They have to make a good case, and they have to tie it to readings and or course activities. So that was the story I wanted to tell you about how I switched from a proctored final that asked people to kind of like think across the course and connect the dots between readings, and this idea of a reflective take-home that I think is both metacognitive and conceptual. So how it's aligned, you can see my 4 intended learning outcomes for the gender and social justice course on the left of the yellow table. And you can see the teaching and learning activities. You can ask me more about those another time if you want. And the assessments that touch on the intended learning outcomes. You can see that the take-home exam actually touches on a couple of the intended learning outcomes. We don't have to have one assessment per outcome. Some assessments cover several outcomes, and sometimes one outcome is hit in several. So that's my story. And Kyle, I think you're going to just take over now with the rest.
I will indeed. Yeah, we just have a little bit more to share, and then we'll leave again, hopefully sometime at the end. There's a couple questions that have come in as you were speaking, Trevor, that we can maybe touch upon a little bit more as a larger discussion. But so as we've kind of seen these almost these stories of sorts of ways to think through taking that final exam and doing it differently within the course, there is still this notion of alignment beyond your course as well, and thinking about how your assessments and what you do in your course plays a role even going beyond that course itself. So for example, you might ask yourself, well, is your course connected to another course? I spoke about this a little bit before, the idea that what you do in your course might still be connected to what happens in a subsequent year, or maybe something happens in an earlier year, a prerequisite course that feeds into your course, and trying to be aware that the assessments that you might be designing might still have to have some sort of connection, or ought to have a connection, to make that pathway for students clearer and more understandable. Might be one consideration. You might go beyond that, though, just thinking about connections to the broader program as well, and what your course's role is within a program. Like, does it have this seminal part in your program where it has to fulfill a certain role, and therefore the assessment might be kind of dictated by your course's role in the program? Or again, does it fit into other programs as well, with some elective courses or courses that can count towards different degree requirements? Like, there's a lot that could be thought about. And again, we're not trying to say with this, like, okay, let's just make your jobs more complicated, but all the same, these are things you might consider too as you think through your courses. And again, you might think about your program's actual program outcomes as well. When we think about how courses fit within a program, again, if you've done any sort of curriculum review or been a part of curriculum review within your own departments, you might have been privy to this kind of conversation already. where we're trying to say, okay, well, the program level outcomes are X, Y, and Z. How does my course's outcomes align with the program level outcomes? And then again, out of all of that, we could then drill it down to the assessment still and say, well, does that assessment play a larger role within the program? This is where, I might go back to something like a poster presentation and say, well, does the program as of right now have many opportunities for students to practice a different modality of even like audio recording themselves for a virtual poster presentation? Maybe that's a skill set that would be neat to develop, and no one else is developing that right now. Maybe my course can do that for the program, and therefore my assessment choice can have a different role. And you might even think beyond that too, other stakeholders might influence the assessment practices of your course. So this diagram here on the right-hand side just kind of shows the interwoven nature of what happens in a course and how it can potentially expand outwards if you take a more discrete look at the outcomes of the course, but how they connect them to assessments and activities as well. Just back to that alignment piece, it is all indeed aligned. So just trying to see what that does look like as well and what kind of role that plays. So again, we return now to this list of examples. Again, we went into detail on 4 of these. You can see, of course, here others as well that you might be interested in that maybe we didn't get the chance to talk about right now. But all the same, we certainly don't want to say, well, we'll never talk about them. And therefore, we'd like to always invite you to chat with us afterwards, or even right now, if you'd like, if some of these kind of sound intriguing to you, but you'd like to hear more about them, or maybe others have experience using some of these as well. And it would be great to hear too, if anyone has tried approaches in your courses that you've explicitly done to try to get away from a proctored kind of time limited final exam, things that you've implemented that you've been quite happy with, or maybe things you've tried and you're like, well, I'm not entirely sure if that worked out well. We'd love to hear about those as well, and maybe talk about those too. So I'm gonna end here and then again open it back up for the remaining, looks like 13-ish minutes or so for questions. But we'll kind of start to wrap it up by saying that it is initially a matter of trying to consider like all these different logistics, and including who will grade, right? So again, I go back to Jim's example here of having himself and 2 TAs involved in the grading. There's certainly been some conversation in the chat about this idea of oral examinations and the academic labor that would be required to make that work. Again, it depends on how long these are and how much TA support you have. There might be a calculation of sorts that tells you how many of these can you realistically do and fit in, while still weighing the benefit of doing an examination in that way compared to the traditional written examination. So again, we want you to think about things like how our activities, how our assessments scaffolded together, ensuring that what you're doing is still valid and reliable, and does it allow for equal access for everyone? It's especially true with remote environments and trying to think through things like bandwidth issues and internet issues that students might have, trying to create opportunities and assessments that don't require unnecessary or challenging requirements for students to succeed with. And those might, again, play a role with internet access. So just being aware of that and thoughtful of that as well. But again, I make that offer to, of course, connect with a CTA liaison or some of our colleagues from the Center for Extended Learning, from the library, ITMS, all via remote teaching at urlu.ca. There's this whole wealth of people who are available to help think through some of these challenges, some of these scenarios for the fall term. Luckily, people like you right now are clearly thinking about the fall term and trying to plan accordingly. So we have a bit of time on our sides to indeed think about some of that. We always like having these kind of conversations and thinking about opportunities that might work for you. Of course, the Keep Learning website is always available for you, a fantastic wealth of resources there that also help think through assessments, and a number of teaching tips here too that we have hyperlinked that again are available in that PDF that I shared at the beginning of the session. But yeah, I'm gonna go back to the previous slide as a kind of a landing spot. We can use that as our talking piece, and just maybe Trevor and I can answer any questions, or is anything that's come up that could involve a little bit of discussion. Happy to do so.
So Syed was mentioning about like big classes in engineering, and I just wanted to give Richard a chance to mention anything that he's encountered in engineering classes, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of them go up to 120 and in certain cohorts and maybe larger. So Richard, what what have you got for us, if anything?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So you're right, especially for first-year engineering classes, it easily gets to over 100. So first of all, yeah, so yeah, that was a great question. So what can we really use in these large engineering classes? So before I really dive into options, so I want to respond to your question about the oral exam. So it's apparently time-consuming. And I can see that, with only 2 TAs supporting with the grading, it's pretty much, really impossible to do. But I just wanted to say that, so I had a conversation with a professor in also in engineering in Conrad School of Entrepreneurship and Business. So he has this idea of, feedback richness concept. So that I just wanted to say that oral exam is actually a great opportunity so that even if you just spend 5 minutes with with a student, you have really the opportunity to get lots of information from a student, and you have the opportunity to give lots of feedback to a student via just that 5-minute video chat. So I mean, on the other hand, also you consider that you spend, how long you spend for marking a written final exam, right? If you ask your students to spend 3 hours to write a final exam, that is worth 50% of the marks, and then you probably would also need to spend quite a bit of time to mark that product. And the thing is that you will lose that opportunity to really give feedback to the students in a very rich communication channel. So that's one thing. Now going back to this options for alternatives to final exams in these large engineering classes. So one thing that I want to bring up is that I also noticed that Nancy mentioned earlier in the session that it's pretty much an urban myth. That's what we call in engineering that most instructors have this 50% final exam in the normal times. So that's partly because we have the accreditation requirements. So you need to have this big piece to really evaluate the graduate attributes according to the accreditation board's requirements. And the reason that I mentioned that is apparently, by the way, now it's a big challenge for folks to really continue that way. So I understand that for the past winter term and the current term, many instructors have abandoned this 50% exam because it's not really feasible at all. What I want to say is that so if you look at the graduate attributes in the accreditation board's requirements, teamwork is there, and there are actually 2 attributes that are related to teamwork. So actually, engineering students are required to collaborate and perform teamwork skills in the courses, and then so that's a good idea when you think about assessments. So that's why I recommend teamwork or peer review assignments in engineering classes, group work, case studies, or you do tutorial sections that you have case studies in each tutorial sections, and you can use those opportunities to do even sometimes you have this 2-stage testing, or like Kyle mentioned, exam wrappers and all those sorts of opportunities that you can use to sort of reduce the workload a bit of marking. And then by having this peer grading or peer assessment, you sort of distribute this labor evenly to the students, while you also encourage opportunity to allow them to demonstrate their teamwork skills. So that's something that you can consider. But of course, I know that you have a specific context in your course that we can perhaps have further conversation on, so that we can examine your learning outcomes and to see why you really need that final exam piece to assess that specific learning outcome, and if we have any opportunities to find out alternatives that we could use to do that instead of that big piece. Again, what we are recommending is that we're not saying that just abandon this final exam idea completely. You still have ways to quizzes and online quizzes in Learn or any platforms. So just sort of reduce this stage of this final piece, and then make more opportunities for this formative assessments to happen, so that so at the end of the day, we are just exploring options to help you to better allow students to take the opportunity to learn, and to get feedback and to use the feedback so that they can do better next time. So that's my comment here, Trevor.
Thanks very much, Richard. I appreciate the comments, and I think too that I want to reiterate that we're not completely opposed to final exam. That's just today our webinar is about imagining other things that we can do. So yes, you can get lots of advice about how to do final exams if you're going to. Some people are under the impression that they have to give final exams, and sometimes there's disciplinary good reasons for that. Sometimes it's an urban myth that you have to have like a 50% final or something in a particular faculty. And even sometimes like the admin will say that that's true, but then others will be like, I don't think that's actually written down anywhere. So if you think about what Richard just said too, yeah, there's ways to do quizzes and learn. If they're the right stakes, people will be less tempted to cheat on them. But on the other hand, do you need to grade them all? When we ask what's formative and what's summative, maybe doing the quiz can be formative, and then a report about where they felt stuck and exactly how they felt stuck and where they overcame it and where they couldn't is what you grade. I know that sounds weird to some people, but it seems to be one of those things that kicks in that metacognitive brain muscle. That's not a muscle. I'm using a metaphor.
I was just going to say as well, like even that notion of trying to encourage like formative quizzing and formative assessment, that otherwise, like how do we ensure students actually do it right? I've even been playing around recently with Quizlet, and so Quizlet. It's another like way to construct quizzes for students, but just some of the functionality of that tool that differs from the standard and learn, and some of the different ways to design quizzes. Like there's like almost kind of gamifies it a little bit. There's an interesting matching one that kind of times how quickly students can match terms together. Like it does it just enough that it's different, and sometimes that novelty and the different aspect of it can be sufficient to get students to be like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll invest at least some time in this. I know there's no grade associated with it, but if it's going to feed into things that I have to do for a larger assessment later on, I think there's always ways to incentivize formative assessment that doesn't need to necessarily have to have a grade associated with it. So just a means of like, well, how do we incentivize it? Either through novelty, either through, I don't know, conditions to do something in the future. So you have to complete a couple of these formative quizzes to, I don't know, get access to something later. Like I think there's ways that we can design experiences that still allow for quizzing, again, low stakes quizzing, where it doesn't matter if one is trying to cheat, so to speak, or to try to circumvent the rules. Like if the opportunities are there to learn from and to better oneself, and then it's up for them to benefit from that and utilize opportunities, then so be it. We're creating those opportunities for our learners in that way as well.
That sounds awfully optimistic, Kyle, that people will actually do the right thing when
I
presented
try
with
sometimes,
multiple options. But I have to say that we're on this panel, which actually turns out to be a manel. This may be the first manel that I've been part of at CTE. Sorry, we don't usually do that. But anyway,
we really don't.
we have a lot of teaching experience between us, and so when we have some of these what might seem like unrealistic optimisms about how students will behave, it does come from kind of trying to inculcate those values in class. And one thing I can say, having been involved in the academic integrity research in Canada in the mid-2000s with like Don McCabe, is that students learn a culture when they get to a university. Most people don't set out to cheat, right? Amanda McKenzie has a great set of slides from the AI office about how many people just are always going to cheat, how many really never would, and then this big mushy middle of people who could be swayed either way by our course design or the culture they find when they get here. So it's on us kind of to like be part of creating a culture where it's shameful to cheat rather than a point of pride, right?
Well, I mean, it looks like we're at 2:29. We have a minute left. I don't see any like burning things come in except Hafina saying as well, kind of another push for Quizlet. So that's good to hear as well. Another example of a way to study from a student perspective. So that's always good to hear as well. So maybe we'll start to wrap things up then. Again, the slides are available. It seems like maybe not for everyone, so we will follow up with an email after the fact too and send those out to you. And again, I will reiterate what we posted on our last slide here about keeping in touch. We always, I think I speak for Trevor and Richard as well, that we truly do enjoy talking through this stuff with people and thinking through ways to do assessments and ways to reconceptualize your assessment. So if at any point in time you want to talk to one of the three of us, or again, your liaison, if that's the person you would turn to, or anyone else from CEL, ITMS, the library, whoever makes sense for you, if you have somebody you like to brainstorm with, please feel free to get in touch. But we always find it, just fun and fascinating to think through how we might reconsider or reconceptualize that final exam, if that's what makes sense for you, and if it's something you're truly concerned about and want to try to do differently. We're here for that. We're here to talk about that. And otherwise, we hope that you found this helpful and useful, and we'll be in touch. Thanks all.